Before we start, please subscribe and like the video. It started subtly, as most things do when they're meant to unravel slowly, like a thread pulled from a finely woven tapestry. Julian Chase, that's me. For years, my life with Sienna Harper had been a steady hum, a comfortable rhythm. We had our routines, our inside jokes. The way she'd always leave her coffee mug on the left side of the sink, and I'd always move it to the right before loading the dishwasher. Small things, but they built a world. We'd been together since college, navigated job changes, family dramas, the usual ebb and flow of a decade-long partnership. Our love wasn't fiery, not in the way movies depict, but it was deep, rooted, like an old oak in a familiar yard. I trusted it, I trusted her. Then, the hum began to falter. It wasn't a sudden crash, more like a distant, almost imperceptible static. Sienna's phone, once a casual accessory, became an extension of her hand, face down on the table during dinner, clutched tight when she walked from room to room. There was a new quickness to her fingers as she typed, a slight turn of her body away from me when a notification buzzed. I'd catch her smiling at the screen, a private, almost giddy smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. When she looked up at me, I'd ask, "Everything okay?" And she'd offer a breezy, "Just Sarah being Sarah," or "Work drama, you know." And I'd nod, because that's what you do when you trust. You accept the surface explanation. But the surface was changing. Her energy, once so intertwined with mine, began to feel distinct, separate. There was a new scent, too, not her usual perfume, the one I'd bought her every Christmas for years. This was something sharper, more modern, with a hint of something floral and expensive. She'd come home, and the scent would precede her, linger in the hallway, a ghost of a presence that wasn't quite hers, or at least, not the her I knew. I'd find myself sniffing the air subtly like a dog trying to catch a fading trail. It was irrational, I told myself. People change perfumes, people get new phones, work gets busy, friends get dramatic. This was just the natural evolution of a long relationship, the settling into a comfortable, if slightly less effusive, space. But the quiet voice inside me, the one that usually stayed silent, began to whisper. It wasn't suspicion yet, not fully. It was more like a low-grade hum of unease, a discordant note in the symphony of our shared life. I'd watch her across the living room, engrossed in her phone, her profile illuminated by the screen's glow, and feel a strange pang, not jealousy, but a profound loneliness. It was as if she was living a vibrant, secret life just inches from me, and I was merely a bystander, watching the flickering images of a story I wasn't a part of. The air in our apartment, once thick with shared laughter and comfortable silences, now felt thin, stretched taut, like a drum skin waiting for a beat that never came. I tried to ignore it, to rationalize it away. Maybe I was just tired, maybe work was getting to me. I'd bury myself in my own projects, the old Honda in the garage, the intricate schematics for the logistics company I managed. I was a man of logic, of systems. Emotions, especially the messy, undefined ones, were not my forte. I preferred things to be clear, quantifiable. But this was a fog, an insidious mist that seeped into every corner of our shared existence, blurring the edges of what I thought I knew. The more I tried to grasp it, the more it slipped through my fingers. One evening, we were on the couch, watching one of our usual Netflix shows. Her hand was in mine, but her thumb was subtly, almost imperceptibly, stroking the side of her phone, which lay face down on the cushion beside her. It was a nervous habit, a tell. My gaze drifted from the screen to her face. Her eyes were fixed on the TV, but there was a tension around her mouth, a slight furrow in her brow that had nothing to do with the plot. It was as if half of her was here, with me, in our familiar space, and the other half was somewhere else entirely, engaged in a conversation, a connection that excluded me. The silence in the room stretched, no longer comfortable, but heavy, pregnant with unspoken questions I wanted to ask, to push, to demand, but the words caught in my throat. What would I even say? Why are you stroking your phone like a lover? It sounded absurd, paranoid, so I just squeezed her hand, a silent plea for connection, and she squeezed back, a practiced, almost automatic gesture, before her thumb resumed its restless journey over the cold glass of her phone, and in that moment, I knew, with a chilling certainty that bypassed logic, that something fundamental had shifted. The tapestry wasn't just unraveling, it was being rewoven, with threads I didn't recognize, into a pattern I couldn't comprehend, and I was standing outside the frame, watching it happen. The quiet deepened, not just between us, but within me. It was the kind of silence that amplifies every small sound, every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren, every breath I took that felt too loud in the stillness. Sienna's presence in the apartment became less about shared space and more about parallel existence. She'd moved through the rooms with a new, almost ghost-like efficiency. Her steps were lighter, less deliberate, as if she were always on the verge of slipping away. When she spoke, her voice had a higher pitch, a bright, almost brittle quality, like a porcelain doll speaking rehearsed lines. The casual touches, the brush of her hand against my arm as she passed, the fleeting kiss on the cheek, they became rarer, then perfunctory, then almost entirely absent. I remember one Tuesday evening, our usual dinner night. I'd cooked her favorite, a slow braised lamb with rosemary and garlic, the aroma filling the apartment. She came home late, phone still in hand, a faint, unfamiliar floral scent clinging to her sweater. "Smells good," she said, her voice a little too cheerful, a little too quick. She dropped her bag by the door, something she rarely did, and went straight to the bathroom. When she emerged, she was in her pajamas, hair still damp from a quick shower. She sat at the table, picked at her food, her eyes drifting to the window, to the wall, anywhere but mine. "Long day?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. She nodded, a quick, dismissive gesture. "Just draining." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication, but I didn't press. I couldn't. The silence felt like a physical barrier between us, a thick, invisible wall that had risen slowly, brick by brick, over the past few weeks. My internal monologue became a constant hum of observation. I was a scientist in my own life, meticulously cataloging every change, every deviation from the norm. Her phone was now almost always on silent, but I'd see the screen light up, a quick glance, a subtle smile, then back to whatever she was pretending to focus on. Her sleep pattern shifted. She'd wake earlier, sometimes slip out of bed before me, or stay up much later, scrolling through her phone in the living room, the faint glow illuminating her face in the dark. I'd lie there, feigning sleep, listening to the soft clicks and whispers of her digital world, a world I was clearly not a part of. The intimacy of our bed, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage where we both performed the act of being together, while our minds drifted miles apart. The emotional silences were the hardest, not the comfortable ones, where you could read a book side by side and feel completely connected. These were silences filled with unspoken words, with questions that burned in my throat, with accusations that hung in the air, unvoiced. I'd try to initiate conversation, something simple, about my day, about a news article, about a plan for the weekend. She'd respond with monosyllables, with a polite but distant interest, as if I were a distant acquaintance making small talk. It was like trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. The harder I tried, the more elusive she became, and the more elusive she became, the more the quiet within me grew, a profound, aching emptiness where shared laughter and easy banter used to reside. I started spending more time in the garage, tinkering with the Honda, its familiar mechanics a welcome contrast to the unpredictable chaos of my home life. The smell of oil and gasoline was a comfort, a tangible reality that didn't shift or lie. I'd lose myself in the intricate workings of the engine, the precise movements required to fix a faulty part. It was a different kind of problem solving, one where the variables were known, the outcomes predictable, in the quiet of the garage. Surrounded by tools and the faint scent of metal, I could almost forget the tightening knot in my chest, the constant hum of unease that followed me like a shadow. One night, I came back inside, hands greasy, mind still lost in the engine's rhythm. Sienna was on the couch, her phone in her lap, a magazine open but unread beside her. She looked up, her eyes bright, almost too bright. "You're back," she said, a nervous laugh bubbling up. "Thought you'd moved into the garage." It was a joke, meant to be liked, but it landed with a thud. I just nodded, walked past her, and headed for the shower. The steam felt good, cleansing, but it couldn't wash away the feeling of being an alien in my own home. The silence that followed was thick, palpable. I knew she was waiting for a response, for a playful retort, for some sign that the old Julian was still there, ready to engage in the familiar dance. But he wasn't. He was gone, replaced by a quiet observer, a man who was learning to live in the echoing silence, a silence that was slowly, inexorably, becoming his new normal. And in that silence, a profound and painful realization began to take root. The relationship, as I knew it, was already a relic, a museum piece. I was just living in its ruins. The unseen threads began to weave a clearer, more disturbing pattern. It wasn't just the phone or the perfume anymore. It was the details, the small, almost insignificant things that, when accumulated, formed an undeniable narrative. One morning, I found a small, delicate silver bracelet on her bedside table. It wasn't her style. Sienna preferred bolder, statement pieces. This was understated, elegant, almost masculine in its simplicity. I picked it up, the cool metal a stark contrast to the warmth of my fingers. No, it wasn't hers. I placed it back down, carefully, as if it were a fragile piece of evidence. Later that week, I saw her wearing it. She caught my eye, and for a fleeting second, her hand went to her wrist, a nervous, almost protected gesture. "New?" I asked, my voice casual. "Oh, this old thing," she replied, too quickly, too dismissively. "Just found it in the back of my jewelry box." The lie hung in the air, thin and transparent, but I didn't challenge it. I just nodded, a silent acknowledgement that I had seen, and she had lied. Her interest in things she once dismissed also became a glaring sign. Suddenly, she was talking about a new, trendy art gallery opening downtown, a niche jazz club, a specific type of single-origin coffee that she'd previously scoffed at. These weren't her interests. They were too specific, too curated, like someone else's preferences had been downloaded into her personality. She'd mentioned them casually, as if they'd always been a part of her world, but I knew the landscape of her passions intimately. I'd spent a decade exploring it with her. This was foreign territory, and the way she spoke about them, with a certain breathless enthusiasm, a light in her eyes that hadn't been there for me in months, it was a gut punch. It wasn't just that she was changing. It was that these changes felt like they were being inspired by someone else for someone else. Her communication style, too, had shifted. She was less prone to long, rambling phone calls with her friends, the kind where I'd hear snippets of gossip and complaints about work from the next room. Now, her calls were shorter, hushed, often taken in the bedroom with the door slightly ajar, or on the balcony, her voice a low murmur against the city sounds. When I'd walk by, she'd end the call abruptly, or switch to a different topic, her eyes flicking to me with a guardedness I'd never seen before. It was as if she was constantly building walls, brick by brick, around her new secret life, and I, the man who had once been privy to every thought, every feeling, was now standing on the outside, watching the construction. The internal struggle was a constant battle between the desire to deny and the creeping certainty. My logical mind, the one that dealt with freight routes and inventory, wanted data, hard evidence, but my gut, the primal part of me that understood unspoken truths, was screaming. It was a slow, agonizing process of dismantling my own reality, piece by piece. Every new clue, every subtle shift, was another hammer blow to the foundation of what I thought was our life. I'd find myself replaying conversations, analyzing her expressions, searching for the moment when the shift began, when the cracks first appeared, but there was no single moment, no dramatic turning point. It was a gradual erosion, an insidious decay that had been happening right under my nose, while I was too busy trusting, too busy believing in the narrative we had built. The feeling of being an outsider in my own home became a pervasive, suffocating reality. I'd walk into a room and feel her presence, but it wasn't the comforting presence of a partner, it was the presence of a stranger, someone I lived with, shared bills with, but no longer truly knew. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of her secrets, with the ghost of the intimacy we once shared. I'd sit on the couch, watching her scroll through her phone, her face illuminated by the screen, and feel a profound sense of alienation. It was as if she was speaking a language I no longer understood, living in a world I couldn't access, and the most painful part was that she seemed perfectly content in that world, a world where I had no place. The oak tree, I realized, was dying from the inside out, and I, its caretaker, was powerless to stop it. The quiet observation turned into a cold, clinical pursuit of truth. My fingers, usually accustomed to the rough texture of engine parts or the smooth glide of a pen across a logistics report, now moved with a deliberate precision across the screen of my laptop. I wasn't driven by rage. Not yet. It was something colder, a profound need for clarity, for the hard, undeniable facts that would shatter the last vestiges of denial. Sienna's social media, once a benign collection of vacation photos and shared memes, became a digital footprint, a breadcrumb trail leading to a truth I was increasingly certain I didn't want to find. I started with her Instagram. She wasn't a prolific poster, but her recent activity showed a subtle shift, more photos of herself, carefully curated, often taken in places I didn't recognize. A new coffee shop with exposed brick, a rooftop bar with a specific city skyline in the background. The captions were vague, almost poetic, about new beginnings and finding light. And then there were the likes, the comments. A new name kept popping up. Leo Whitmore. His profile picture was a professional headshot, a sharp jawline, a confident smirk. His bio was equally polished. Entrepreneur, visionary, living life unfiltered. No mutual friends, no obvious connection to our shared world. I clicked on his profile, a cold knot forming in my stomach. His feed was a gallery of expensive tastes, luxury cars, exotic travel destinations, high-end restaurants, and there, amidst the curated opulence, were the subtle overlaps. A photo of a specific cocktail glass, identical to one I'd seen Sienna post a week earlier, a blurred background in one of his selfies, featuring a distinctive piece of art that looked suspiciously like the one in the lobby of the new art gallery Sienna had suddenly become interested in. It was like piecing together a complex puzzle, each small detail fitting into a larger, more devastating picture. Then I found it, a photo of Sienna, taken from a slightly different angle than her own post, at that same rooftop bar. She was laughing, her head thrown back, a genuine, uninhibited laugh I hadn't heard from her in months, and standing beside her, his arm casually draped around her waist, was Leo Whitmore. His smile was wide, possessive. The caption read, "Making memories with this one. Hashtag unforgettable, hashtag good times." My breath hitched, but my hands remained steady. There was no surge of anger, no immediate wave of heartbreak, just a profound, heavy calm. It was the moment of confirmation, the final piece of the puzzle slotting into place. The window had been cleaned, and the view was stark, undeniable. I scrolled further, a detached observer. I found comments from Leo on Sienna's posts, playful emojis, inside jokes that made no sense to me. Her replies were equally flirtatious, a side of her I hadn't seen directed at me in years. It was all there, laid bare in the cold, unforgiving light of the digital world. The feeling wasn't vindication. It was a strange, almost clinical sadness. I was watching her erase me from her narrative, replacing me with a new, more exciting character, and the most painful part was the ease with which she seemed to be doing it. I started taking screenshots, meticulously, methodically. Each image was a brick, not for revenge, but for the foundation of a new reality. Her posts, his posts, the comments, the timestamps. I created a folder on my desktop, labeled simply Sienna. It felt like an autopsy, dissecting the remnants of a life I thought was ours. The digital footprint was undeniable, a cold, hard truth that bypassed all her vague excuses and practiced indifference. She hadn't just drifted away. She had actively, deliberately, built a new world, a new life, a new connection, and I was not a part of it. The silence in the room was no longer heavy with questions. It was heavy with answers, and the weight of that knowledge was immense. The immediate aftermath of discovering the digital proof was not the explosion I might have anticipated. There was no shattering of glass, no shouted accusations, no tears. Instead, a profound, almost chilling calm settled over me. It was the kind of stillness that follows a violent storm, when the air is clear but heavy with the scent of rain and broken things. My heart didn't race. It slowed, a steady, deliberate beat, as if my body, in its ancient wisdom, understood that this was not a moment for panic, but for profound, quiet processing. I sat at my desk, the laptop screen still displaying the damning images, the digital breadcrumbs of her betrayal. I stared at Leo Whitmore's confident smirk, at Sienna's uninhibited laugh, at the casual possessiveness of his arm around her waist, and in that moment, something inside me shifted irrevocably. The nagging unease, the subtle whispers, the creeping certainty, they all coalesced into an undeniable truth. And with that truth came a strange, almost perverse sense of relief. The fog had lifted, the blurry edges had sharpened. The monster under the bed, once a terrifying unknown, was now clearly visible, and while it was ugly, it was no longer a phantom. There was a quiet, almost surgical detachment to my thoughts. I wasn't angry in the way I thought I would be, not the fiery, destructive rage that demands retribution. It was a cold, intellectual anger, a betrayal of trust that felt more like a mathematical error in a carefully constructed equation. She hadn't just cheated. She had fundamentally misrepresented our reality, our shared history. She had built a parallel universe, and I had been living in blissful, ignorant oblivion. The pain wasn't a sharp, piercing agony, but a dull, pervasive ache, like a phantom limb that was no longer there. I closed the laptop, the click echoing loudly in the silent apartment. The darkness of the screen reflected my own face, calm, almost serene. It was a face I barely recognized, the old Julian, the one who would have fought, pleaded, demanded answers, was gone. In his place was a man stripped bare, raw, but strangely resilient. This wasn't a moment for confrontation. What would be the point? The evidence was irrefutable. Her actions spoke louder than any words she could offer, any excuses she could concoct, and my response, I realized, would be in my silence, in my quiet, deliberate actions. The feeling of a fundamental rupture was immense. It wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of a narrative, a story I had believed in, a future I had meticulously planned. The foundation of our life, built brick by brick over a decade, had crumbled, not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a laptop fan and the click of a mouse. There was no going back. The path forward was clear, however painful. It was a path of separation, of disentanglement, of meticulously unweaving the threads that had once bound us together. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. My hands didn't tremble, my breath was even. The apartment felt different now, imbued with the weight of this new knowledge. Every object, every shared space, seemed to hum with the unspoken truth. The coffee mug on the left side of the sink, the one I always moved to the right. It was still there, a symbol of a routine that was now a relic. I left it. I didn't move it. That small act of defiance, of breaking a decade-long habit, felt more significant than any shouted word. The relief, I realized, came from the cessation of the internal battle, the constant questioning, the gnawing doubt, the exhausting effort of trying to rationalize away the inexplicable. It was all over. The truth, however brutal, was a solid ground beneath my feet, and on that ground I could begin to rebuild, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with a quiet, steely resolve. The silence in the apartment was no longer filled with the static of unease. It was filled with a profound, heavy calm of certainty, and in that certainty I found a strange, unexpected strength. Sienna's continued obliviousness, or perhaps her masterful performance of it, became a strange, almost theatrical element in our shared apartment. She moved through the space with the same breezy detachment, the same hurried phone calls, the same new perfume, but now I saw it all through a different lens. Her every gesture, every carefully chosen word, every subtle avoidance, was a part of a script she was performing, and I was the unwitting audience. The knowledge I held was a silent weapon, a secret that hummed beneath the surface of our interactions, unseen but profoundly present. Our conversations became a silent dance of unspoken truths. She'd ask about my day, her voice light, almost too light. I'd respond with clipped, factual answers, devoid of emotion, devoid of the intimacy we once shared. She'd offer a fleeting smile, a quick touch to my arm, gestures that once would have been comforting, but now felt hollow, manipulative. I'd meet her gaze, my eyes calm, unwavering, searching for a flicker of recognition, a hint that she knew I knew, but there was nothing, just the polished surface of her performance, a mask so perfectly crafted it was almost believable. My internal monologue was a constant stream of observation, a dissection of her every move. I saw the way her eyes darted to her phone when it buzzed, even on silent. I noticed the subtle tension in her jaw when I mentioned something about my evening plans, a fleeting moment of anxiety before she recomposed herself. She was a master of self-deception, or perhaps simply a master of deception. The thought twisted in my gut, not with anger, but with a profound sadness for the person she had become, for the person she had always been, hidden beneath layers of charm and practiced affection. I began to reflect on the nature of lies, on how easily they could be woven into the fabric of everyday life, how they could distort reality until the truth became unrecognizable. She wasn't just lying to me. She was lying to herself, creating a narrative where her choices were justified, where her actions had no consequences, and in her unwavering commitment to that narrative, she revealed a chilling capacity for self-preservation, a willingness to sacrifice honesty for comfort, truth for convenience. The more I observed her, the more I understood that her betrayal wasn't a moment of weakness, but a fundamental aspect of her character. I started to detach emotionally, seeing her less as my partner and more as a character in a play I was now only observing. The emotional connection, once so strong, began to fray, then snap, thread by thread. Her presence in the apartment became less about shared life and more about shared space. A temporary arrangement until the inevitable separation. I no longer felt the urge to touch her, to comfort her, to connect with her. The well of empathy had run dry, replaced by a cold, analytical gaze. It was a strange, almost liberating feeling, to be free from the emotional entanglement, to be able to see her clearly, without the distorting lens of love or expectation. The apartment, once our sanctuary, now felt like a stage. Every interaction was a scene, every word a line, and I, the quiet observer, was watching the final act of a tragedy, not with tears, but with a profound sense of inevitability. The silence between us, once heavy with unspoken questions, was now filled with unspoken answers, and in that silence I found a strange kind of peace, a quiet strength that came from knowing the truth, however painful, and from no longer having to pretend, The ghost of our intimacy lingered, a faint scent in the air, but it no longer haunted me. It was simply a reminder of what once was, and what would never be again. The process of reclaiming my personal space and time began subtly, almost instinctively. It wasn't a conscious decision to punish Sienna, but a primal need for self-preservation, for air to breathe in a suffocating environment. I started spending more evenings out, not with a grand purpose, but simply to be elsewhere. The gym became a more frequent destination, the rhythmic thud of my feet on the treadmill a welcome counterpoint to the quiet tension at home. I reconnected with Owen Calloway, a friend from college I hadn't seen much of lately. We grab a beer, talk about work, about life, about everything and nothing. I didn't mention Sienna, not directly, but Owen, with his quiet perceptiveness, seemed to sense the shift in my demeanor, the subtle tightening around my eyes. He didn't push, just listened, offered a knowing nod, and filled the silence with his own easy presence. At home, I began to carve out my own routines, separate from hers. I'd wake earlier, make my own coffee, eat breakfast at the kitchen counter while listening to a podcast, rather than waiting for her to stir. I started cooking only for myself, simple, functional meals, leaving her to fend for her own dinner. The shared rituals, once the bedrock of our domestic life, slowly dissolved, replaced by individual habits. It was a quiet act of defiance, a silent declaration of independence. I wasn't trying to provoke a reaction. I was simply living my life, on my own terms, within the confines of a shared space that no longer felt shared. The atmosphere in the home began to shift, mirroring my internal changes. The air, once thick with her presence, felt lighter, less suffocating. Her new perfume, which had once felt like an invasive scent, now seemed to dissipate more quickly, less potent. There was a faint hum of my own energy, a quiet resolve that filled the spaces she left empty. Sienna, I noticed, seemed to pick up on this. She'd hover in doorways, her gaze lingering on me for a fraction of a second longer, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. She'd ask, "Everything okay?" Or, "You've been out a lot lately." Her voice would carry a subtle undertone of unease, a hint of the control she was losing. I'd respond with a calm, almost detached politeness. "Just busy." Or, "Needed some space." No drama, no accusation, just the simple truth, delivered with the weight of a stone. She'd try to probe, to find an angle, a way back into the familiar dynamic where she held the emotional reins. "Are you upset about something?" she'd ask, her voice laced with a faint concern. I'd meet her gaze, my eyes calm, steady. "No, Sienna, just making adjustments." The words were simple, but they carried a profound weight, a quiet finality that seemed to rattle her more than any outburst ever could. The deliberate act of creating distance wasn't about punishment. It was about self-preservation. I was learning to breathe again, to exist independently, to define myself outside the context of our relationship. The emotional energy I had once poured into trying to understand her, to bridge the growing chasm between us, was now redirected inwards, towards rebuilding myself. The silence in the apartment, once a source of anxiety, became a canvas for my own thoughts, my own healing. I was learning to be comfortable in my own company, to find solace in the quiet hum of my own existence, and in that quiet, I felt a strength I hadn't known I possessed, a resilience forged in the crucible of betrayal. The old oak, though scarred, was beginning to sprout new leaves, reaching for the sun on its own terms. Sienna's subtle attempts to re-engage, born perhaps from a nascent awareness of my withdrawal, were almost pathetic in their transparency. She'd start making my coffee the way I liked it, black, a habit she'd long forgotten. She'd leave small notes on the counter, mundane reminders about groceries or dry cleaning, signed with a small, almost hesitant heart. She'd suggest watching a movie or going for a walk, activities we hadn't shared in months. Each gesture was a small, desperate olive branch extended into a void she was only just beginning to perceive, but they landed flat, like pebbles dropped into a bottomless well. My reflection on my past self, the man who would have fought, pleaded, tried to fix, was a stark and illuminating process. I remembered the countless times I had swallowed my pride, rationalized her behavior, bit myself into knots to maintain a semblance of peace. The man who had believed that love meant endless compromise, even at the cost of his own well-being, he was a ghost now, a faint echo in the corridors of my memory. I looked at myself in the mirror, at the subtle lines etched around my eyes, the quiet resolve in my gaze. I no longer recognized that man, nor did I want to. He was a casualty of a war I hadn't known I was fighting. The realization that I no longer wanted to be that man was a profound liberation. There was a quiet strength in my detachment, a sense of self-possession that had been absent for too long. I was no longer defined by her needs, her moods, her unspoken desires. I was defining myself, brick by brick, in the quiet solitude of my own thoughts. The emotional energy that had once been consumed by anxiety and doubt was now redirected, flowing into the nascent shoots of my own healing. I found myself rediscovering old passions, reading books I had put aside, listening to music that resonated with a deeper, quieter part of me. The growing sense of self-worth independent of the relationship was a slow, steady tide. It wasn't a triumphant surge, but a gentle rising, a quiet confidence that settled deep within my bones. I was learning that my value wasn't tied to her approval, her presence, or her fidelity. My worth was inherent, a constant, unchanging truth that had been obscured by years of quiet erosion. The betrayal, in its brutal honesty, had stripped away the illusions, revealing a core of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. Sienna, in her desperate attempts to salvage a semblance of normalcy, seemed to misinterpret my quiet detachment as a sign of thawing, a prelude to reconciliation. She'd talk about future plans, about holidays, about old memories, her voice laced with a forced nostalgia, but her words felt hollow, echoing in the vast emptiness between us. She was clinging to a past that no longer existed, to a version of me that had ceased to be, and I, the quiet observer, watched her performance with a detached curiosity, a profound sadness for her inability to face the truth. The silence, once a barrier, had become my sanctuary, a space where I could finally breathe, finally exist, on my own terms. The oak tree, though scarred, was standing tall, its roots reaching deep into the earth, drawing strength from within. The quiet conversation, when it finally happened, wasn't a planned event. It unfolded organically, like a slow-motion unraveling, one evening after she'd returned from what she vaguely referred to as errands. The new perfume was faint, almost imperceptible, a sign, perhaps, of her trying to revert to a more familiar scent, a more familiar self. She walked into the living room where I was reading, and paused, hovering by the doorway. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her voice softer than usual, a tentative probe into the silence. I lowered my book, meeting her gaze. My eyes were calm, steady, devoid of accusation. "I suppose I have," I replied, my voice even, uninflected. There was no emotion in it, no anger, no sadness, just a simple statement of fact. This was not a negotiation, this was a declaration. She shifted her weight, her hands clasped in front of her, a nervous habit I remembered from early in our relationship when she was uncertain. "Is something wrong, Julian?" she asked, the question laced with a feigned innocence that was almost insulting. I held her gaze. "Wrong, Sienna? That's a broad term. What do you consider wrong?" My words were quiet, almost a whisper, but they carried the weight of everything unsaid, everything I knew. Her composure flickered, just for a second. Her eyes darted away, then back to mine, searching, probing, trying to find the crack in my facade, the emotional vulnerability she was accustomed to exploiting. "I mean, between us," she clarified, her voice a little higher now, a hint of desperation creeping in. "Are we okay?" I leaned back against the cushions, a profound weariness settling over me. Are we okay, Sienna? Or are we just existing? The question hung in the air, heavy and pointed. She blinked, her mouth opening slightly, then closing. The defensiveness, her usual weapon, was slow to materialize. She seemed genuinely caught off guard by my calm, by the absence of the emotional reaction she expected. I don't understand, she stammered, though her eyes betrayed a dawning comprehension. You understand more than you're letting on, I said, my voice still quiet, almost gentle. The phone calls, the late nights, the new perfume, the unexpected interests, the man on the yacht. The last phrase, delivered with the same calm cadence as the others, hit her like a physical blow, her face drained of color, her eyes widening in a mixture of shock and dawning fear. The carefully constructed mask shattered, revealing the raw panic beneath. She stumbled back a step, her hands flying to her mouth. How do you know? The whisper was barely audible. I paid attention, I replied, the words simple, devastating. Something you stopped doing a long time ago. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening. It was not the comfortable silence of shared intimacy, nor the tense silence of unspoken questions. It was the silence of a world collapsing, of a truth finally laid bare. Her eyes, wide and terrified, searched mine, but found no anger, no rage, no emotional leverage, just a quiet, unwavering resolve. The power of my calm was immense, a force she had never encountered, and clearly had no defense against. She swallowed hard, her throat working. Julian, I can explain. I shook my head, a slow, deliberate movement. There's nothing to explain, Sienna. The explanation is in the silence you created, in the choices you made, in the life you built without me. I've seen it all, I've heard it all, and I've understood it all, quietly. She stood there, frozen, a statue of betrayal and dawning consequence. The boundaries were drawn, silently but firmly. No dramatic confrontation was needed. The truth, delivered with a calm, unwavering voice, was more potent than any scream, and in that moment, I felt a profound sense of clarity, a quiet freedom that came from finally speaking the unspoken, from finally acknowledging the reality that had been simmering beneath the surface for too long. The oak tree, though its branches were scarred, had finally shed its dead leaves, making way for new growth. The decision to initiate divorce proceedings was not an emotional one, it was a logical conclusion, a necessary administrative step in the dismantling of a structure that had already crumbled. The profound calm that had settled over me in the wake of discovering the truth remained, a steady anchor in the swirling currents of what was to come. There was no anger, no desire for retribution, just a quiet, almost detached resolve to formalize what had already happened in the quiet spaces of our lives. I found a lawyer through Owen Calloway, a referral to a firm known for its discretion and efficiency. My first meeting was clinical, almost sterile. I laid out the facts, presented the meticulously gathered digital evidence, the screenshots, the timestamps, the social media trails. My lawyer, a seasoned woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, her pen scratching quietly on her notepad. She didn't ask about my feelings, about the emotional toll, and I appreciated that. This wasn't a therapy session, it was a legal consultation. The paperwork arrived a few days later, a thick stack of documents that felt strangely impersonal, petitions, disclosures, financial statements. Each form was a line item in the ledger of our dissolved life. I filled them out with a steady hand, my mind focused on the details, the numbers, the precise language required. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. This was a necessary step, a practical matter. The emotional battle had already been fought and, in its own quiet way, won. The contrast between the legal finality and the emotional journey I had already undertaken was striking. The law required proof, documentation, a formal process to dissolve a marriage, but the marriage itself, the emotional bond, had been dissolving for months, slowly, quietly, without the need for courts or lawyers. The legal process felt like an echo, a formal recognition of a death that had already occurred. It was a necessary formality, a way to ensure a clean break, to protect myself from further erosion. I remember sitting at the dining table, the divorce papers spread out before me, the faint scent of ink mingling with the lingering, almost ghost-like scent of Sienna's new perfume. I signed my name, the pen scratching softly against the paper, and felt nothing, no surge of relief, no pang of regret, just a quiet sense of completion, like closing a book after reading the final page. The future, once so inextricably linked to hers, now stretched out before me, blank and unwritten, a vast canvas, waiting for new colors, new strokes. The thought of her reaction, when she received the papers, was a fleeting consideration. Would she be angry? Sad? Defensive? It didn't matter. Her reaction was her own to bear. My focus was on my own path, on the quiet rebuilding that lay ahead. The legal steps were just that. Steps. Each one brought me closer to a future defined by my own choices, my own terms. The feeling of closure wasn't a sudden burst of light, but a slow, steady dawn. It was the quiet knowledge that I had done what was necessary, protected myself, and honored the truth. The legal process, though formal, was simply a reflection of the internal shift that had already occurred. The marriage, once a living, breathing entity, was now a legal document, a piece of paper that marked an ending, and in that ending, I found a quiet, profound beginning. The oak tree, though its leaves had fallen, stood firm, its roots holding strong, ready for a new season. Sienna's reaction to the divorce papers, when they were finally served, was precisely as I had anticipated, a mix of initial shock, followed by a desperate, almost frantic attempt to salvage the wreckage. The papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a polite, uniformed courier. I was in the living room when she opened the envelope, her brow furrowed in confusion, then disbelief, then a dawning horror. Her face, usually so composed, crumpled, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a raw, unmasked vulnerability I hadn't witnessed in years. "What is this, Julian?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, the papers trembling in her hand. I met her gaze, my own eyes calm, unwavering. "It's what it looks like, Sienna, at the end." She shook her head, a frantic, almost childlike gesture of denial. No, we don't need to do this. We can talk. We can fix this." Her voice rose, a desperate plea. "We stopped talking a long time ago," I replied, my voice quiet but firm. "And there's nothing left to fix. The foundation is gone." She tried to argue, to plead, to invoke old memories, but her words felt hollow, devoid of genuine emotion. It was a performance, a desperate attempt to regain control, to rewrite the narrative, but I was no longer her audience. I listened, calmly, patiently, but my resolve was unshakable. The emotional theatrics, which once would have swayed me, now seemed distant, almost comical. The quiet packing of her things began that afternoon. It wasn't a dramatic affair. No angry words, no slammed doors, just the methodical rustle of clothes being folded, the soft click of hangers, the dull thud of items being placed into boxes. I stayed in the living room, reading, working on my laptop, creating a silent space for her to gather her life. Occasionally, she'd pass by, carrying a box of books or a laundry basket filled with her clothes, her gaze lingering on me, searching for a reaction, a sign of weakness, but I offered none. My presence was calm, almost invisible, a silent witness to her departure. The gradual emptying of the shared space was a strange, almost surreal experience. Her perfume, once a constant presence, began to fade, replaced by the clean, neutral scent of an apartment slowly being reclaimed. Her side of the closet became bare, the empty hangers rattling faintly in the breeze from the open window. The bathroom counter, once cluttered with her array of products, was now stark, minimalist. Each empty space felt like a breath of fresh air, a quiet liberation. The feeling of saying goodbye to a ghost was profound. It wasn't just Sienna who was leaving. It was the ghost of the woman I thought I knew, the ghost of the life we had built, the ghost of the future I had envisioned. And in their departure, I felt a strange sense of peace. The quiet ache that had lingered for months began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet lightness. The weight of her secrets, her lies, her emotional absence was finally lifting. One evening, as the last of her boxes were stacked by the door, she paused, her hand on the doorknob. She looked around the apartment, her eyes sweeping over the familiar spaces, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, nostalgia, regret, perhaps even a hint of fear for the unknown future. "This is it, then," she whispered, her voice thin, almost fragile. "This is it," I confirmed, my voice calm, steady. She didn't cry, she didn't argue, she just nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible movement, and then she walked out, the door closing softly behind her, not slammed, not dramatic, just a quiet click that marked the end of an era. And in that quiet click, I felt a profound sense of finality, a release from the long, agonizing process of unraveling. The ghost was gone, and I was finally free to breathe. The oak tree, stripped bare by the storm, stood firm, its roots holding strong, ready for the quiet promise of a new spring. The immediate aftermath of Sienna moving out was not a moment of celebration, but a profound, almost disorienting silence. The apartment, once filled with the subtle hum of her presence, the faint scent of her perfume, the distant murmur of her phone calls, now felt vast, empty, echoing with the absence of a decade of shared life. But it wasn't a sad emptiness, it was a spaciousness, a quiet invitation to simply be. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if a heavy shroud had been lifted. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps surprisingly loud on the hardwood floors. Her side of the bed was stark, the sheets pulled back, revealing the bare mattress. Her closet was empty, the hangers rattling softly in the breeze from the open window. There was no lingering scent of her, no forgotten hair tie on the bathroom counter, no half-empty mug by the sink. She had left no trace, and in that complete absence, I found a strange kind of liberation. The emotional energy I had been expending, consciously and unconsciously, on navigating her presence, on deciphering her moods, on bracing for the next subtle betrayal, it all simply ceased, and in that cessation, I felt a profound sense of lightness, a quiet, almost exhilarating freedom. I remember standing in the middle of the living room, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with a clean, unburdened air, and for the first time in what felt like years, I felt my shoulders drop, the tension that had been a constant companion finally releasing its grip. It was the first real breath I'd taken, a breath untainted by suspicion, by unspoken words, by the weight of a dying relationship. The beginning of active self-healing was not a conscious decision, but an instinctive pull towards quiet restoration. I started with small things. I rearranged the living room furniture, shifting the couch to face the window, inviting more light into the space. I bought new bedsheets, crisp white linen that felt clean and fresh. I filled the empty spaces in the apartment with things that brought me quiet joy. A new bookshelf filled with books I'd been meaning to read, a small, vibrant plant for the kitchen counter, a comfortable armchair for reading by the window. Each addition was a small act of self-care, a quiet declaration of my own presence in this newly reclaimed space. I spent more time in the garage, not just fixing the Honda, but building things for myself. A sturdy workbench, a set of custom shelves for my tools, the tangible act of creation, of seeing something take shape under my hands, was deeply satisfying. It was a stark contrast to the invisible, intangible unraveling I had witnessed in my relationship. Here, in the garage, the results were clear, solid, undeniable. The process was slow, quiet, and deeply personal. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic transformations, just the steady, methodical work of rebuilding, piece by piece, the life that had been quietly eroded. The silence in the apartment, once a source of anxiety, now felt like a comforting presence, a space for introspection and quiet growth. It was a profound shift, a quiet revolution in the landscape of my own being. The oak tree, though its branches were bare, was beginning to draw new life from its deep, resilient roots, preparing for a spring that was entirely its own. The focus shifted entirely to my own well-being and the quiet, deliberate construction of a future that was solely mine. The apartment, once a stage for unspoken dramas, became a sanctuary, a space where I could simply exist, unburdened by external expectations. I continued my routine of early mornings, the quiet solitude of coffee and a book, the rhythmic exertion of the gym, but now, these activities felt less like an escape and more like a foundation, the bedrock of a new, self-sufficient existence. I deepened my connection with Owen Calloway. He was a steady presence, a man of few words, but profound understanding. We'd meet for runs, pushing ourselves through the city streets, the exertion a shared language. Over post-workout coffees, we'd talk about work, about the quiet challenges of life, about the subtle shifts in perspective that come with age. I still didn't explicitly detail the full extent of Sienna's betrayal, but Owen, with his quiet perceptiveness, seemed to understand the unspoken narrative. He offered support not through advice, but through presence, through the simple act of being there, a steady, reliable anchor in the shifting landscape of my life. His friendship was a quiet affirmation that genuine connection still existed, a stark contrast to the hollow intimacy I had left behind. Then, there was Nora Bennett. I met her at a local bookstore, both of us reaching for the same obscure poetry collection. She had a quiet intensity in her eyes, a thoughtful smile that crinkled at the corners. Our conversation started with books, then drifted to art, to music, to the small, profound observations about life. There was an ease to our banter, a genuine curiosity in her questions, a willingness to truly listen to the answers. It was different from anything I had experienced with Sienna in years. There was no pretense, no performance, just a simple, honest exchange of thoughts and feelings. We started meeting for coffee, then for walks in the park. Our interactions were light, unpressured, built on shared interests and a mutual respect for quiet introspection. I found myself opening up to her, slowly, cautiously, sharing snippets of my past, the quiet unraveling of my marriage, the profound sense of detachment that had preceded the formal separation. Nora listened without judgment, her eyes warm, empathetic. She didn't offer solutions or platitudes, just a quiet understanding that felt like a balm to my still healing soul. The contrast in our interactions compared to my past relationship was striking. With Sienna, every conversation had felt like a negotiation, every shared moment a performance. With Nora, it was effortless, a natural flow of ideas and emotions. There was no need to decipher hidden meanings, no subtle cues to interpret. Her honesty was refreshing, her presence grounding. It wasn't love, not yet, not in the grand, sweeping sense, but it was a genuine connection, a quiet joy that blossomed in the space of honesty and mutual respect. I realized that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about building something stronger, something new, on the foundations of truth and self-awareness. The scars remained, faint but present, reminders of the fire I had walked through, but they no longer defined me. They were simply a part of my story, a testament to my resilience. And in the quiet joy of genuine connection, in the steady rhythm of building anew, I found a profound sense of peace. The oak tree, though it bore the marks of a past storm, was putting down new roots, its branches reaching towards a future filled with the promise of quiet, authentic growth. The echoes of the past, once loud and insistent, began to fade into a distant hum. Life moved forward, steadily, quietly, and I moved with it, no longer looking over my shoulder. The divorce was finalized, the legal papers a thin, almost forgotten stack in a drawer, the shared accounts were severed, the last vestiges of our intertwined financial lives neatly untangled. It was all done, clean and efficient, just as I had intended. A few months after Sienna had fully moved out, I heard snippets of news through the grapevine, mostly from acquaintances who still moved in overlapping social circles. She had, apparently, moved in with Leo Whitmore. There were whispers of a lavish lifestyle, of expensive trips, and public displays of affection. The details were vague, secondhand, but they confirmed what I already knew. She had found her new narrative, her new stage. And I, for the first time, felt nothing, no anger, no jealousy, no lingering sadness, just a quiet, almost detached curiosity. One afternoon, I was walking through a busy downtown market with Nora Bennett, browsing a stall of handmade ceramics. The sun was warm on my face, the air filled with the scent of fresh bread and blooming flowers. We were laughing about something trivial, a shared joke about a particularly hideous garden gnome, and then I saw her, Sienna. She was across the market, her back to me, talking animatedly to someone I couldn't see. Her hair was styled differently, a brighter blonde, and she wore a dress I didn't recognize, something sleek and vibrant. My breath didn't hitch, my heart didn't race, there was no surge of adrenaline, no tightening in my chest, just a quiet recognition, like seeing a familiar face in a crowd of strangers. Nora, sensing my slight pause, followed my gaze. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft, perceptive. I nodded, a faint smile touching my lips. "Yeah," I said, turning back to her, to the warmth of her presence, to the quiet joy of our shared moment. "Just saw someone I used to know." Sienna turned then, her head tilted back in laughter, and for a fleeting second, her eyes swept across the crowd, landing, briefly, on me. There was no flicker of recognition, no dawning realization. Her gaze passed over me, unseeing, as if I were just another face in the bustling market, and in that moment, I knew, with a profound and absolute certainty, that the pain had truly faded. I was no longer a part of her narrative, and she was no longer a source of pain in mine. The confirmation that the pain had truly faded was a quiet, internal victory. It wasn't about forgetting, or about erasing the past, it was about transformation. The raw wound had healed, leaving behind a scar, a subtle mark that reminded me of where I had been, but no longer dictated where I was going. Her choices were her own, and her path was now entirely separate from mine. There was no need for explanation, no desire for closure from her. The closure had come from within, from the quiet work of rebuilding, from the steady rhythm of self-discovery. The quiet satisfaction of having navigated the storm with dignity was a deeply personal triumph. I hadn't succumbed to bitterness, to anger, to the destructive impulses that often accompany betrayal. I had chosen a different path, a path of quiet strength, of introspection, of deliberate rebuilding, and in that choice, I had found a profound sense of peace, a quiet freedom that was more valuable than any vindication. The oak tree, though it had weathered a fierce storm, stood tall and strong, its branches reaching towards the sun, its roots firmly planted in the rich, fertile soil of its own resilience. The echoes of the past had faded, replaced by the quiet, steady hum of a life lived on my own terms. The journey had been long, quiet, and profoundly introspective. It wasn't a dramatic saga, but a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the tectonic plates of my own being. The man who had sat in the silent apartment, meticulously cataloging betrayal, was not the same man who now walked through the city with a quiet confidence, his hand occasionally brushing Nora Bennett's as they talked about books and art. Healing, I had come to understand, wasn't a destination, but a continuous process. There wasn't a finish line, no grand declaration of being fixed. It was in the small moments, the genuine laughter shared with Owen Calloway, the thoughtful conversations with Nora, the the quiet satisfaction of a well-executed project in the garage. It was in the absence of the old anxieties, the quiet hum of peace where constant unease once resided. The scars remained, subtle lines on the landscape of my soul, reminders of the fire I had walked through, but they no longer burned. They were simply a part of my story, a testament to resilience, to the quiet strength found in the face of profound loss. The clarity that had emerged from the fog of betrayal was a precious gift. I saw myself more clearly, my own strengths and vulnerabilities. I understood the nature of trust, not as a blind faith, but as a conscious choice, built on honesty and mutual respect. I understood that love, true love, was not about ownership or control, but about shared growth, about two individuals walking side by side, each whole in their own right. Freedom, too, was not a wild, untamed thing. It was a quiet, internal liberation, a shedding of the emotional chains that had bound me to a dying narrative. It was the freedom to choose my own path, to define my own happiness, to build a future unburdened by the weight of someone else's choices. There was no desire for revenge, no lingering bitterness. Sienna had made her choices, and I had made mine. Our paths had diverged. And in that divergence, I had found my own way back to myself. I still woke early, still made my coffee black, still sought the quiet solitude of the morning, but now, the silence was not an echo of absence, but a canvas for possibility. The apartment, once a museum of a broken life, was now a home, filled with the warmth of my own presence, the quiet hum of my own contentment. Sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of my reflection in the window at dusk, the city lights blurring behind me. I saw a man who had been broken, yes, but also a man who had rebuilt, stronger, quieter, more profoundly himself than he had ever been. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. It had stripped away the illusions, revealing the resilient core beneath, and in that core, I found a quiet, unwavering strength, a profound sense of self-possession that was, in its own understated way, everything. The oak tree, having weathered the storm, stood tall, its roots deep, its branches reaching for a future unwritten, but full of quiet, authentic promise.